I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're talking to Max Bernt, Managing Director for Taxbit in Europe, in what I promise will be the liveliest discussion on taxation in the crypto space you ever heard. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there's been a laser focus on stopping Russia from accessing funds in order to continue to execute its war. In a recent report by TRM, we explore the Russia-speaking illicit crypto ecosystem. From ransomware groups to illicit marketplace operators, Russian-speaking threat actors have become a ubiquitous force in international crypto crime. Due to the online nature of crypto transactions and widespread use of privacy tools, it is often difficult to confirm whether these actors are in fact based in Russia or have ties to the government. Yet whatever their location, TRM research shows that these groups and individuals, united by their use of the Russian language, play an outsized role in most types of crypto-enabled cybercrime. Interestingly, over the last few years, we've seen Russia-based exchanges like Suex, Garantex, Chadex, and Russia-based or Russian language darknet markets like Hydra be the focus of sanctions and other types of law enforcement actions from the U.S. Treasury Department, European authorities, and law enforcement. Russian-speaking threat actors from across the former Soviet Union consistently drive most types of crypto-enabled cybercrime, from ransomware to illicit crypto exchanges and darknet markets. For example, Russian-speaking ransomware groups, according to TRM, accounted for at least 69% of all crypto proceeds from ransomware in 2023, exceeding about $500 million. Russian-speaking darknet markets comprise 95% of all crypto-denominated illicit drug sales on the dark web in 2023. And in terms of sanctions, inflows to just one Russia-based crypto exchange, Garantex, accounted for over 80% of crypto volumes belonging to all sanctioned entities internationally. While there are certain exceptions to the dominance of Russian-speaking crypto crime, North Korea, for example, remains the world's hacking superpower, responsible for stealing close to $1 billion in cryptocurrency in 2023. In many respects, all roads lead to Russia when it comes to illicit finance and money laundering. Now let's sit down with Max Bernt. Max, thank you for joining TRM Talks.
Oh, it's a pleasure as well. Thank you for the invite, Ari.
So I was doing a little research for the podcast, and I noticed that you were a model. And this was not entirely surprising to me because you are a very good-looking guy, but it was a little surprising. The model to tax policy expert was sort of like a really interesting journey. Could you tell me a little bit, what was that experience like?
Ari, I like that. You know, I was born and raised in Austria in the countryside, a village of barely 3,000 people. So I guess similarly to Arnold Schwarzenegger did with bodybuilding, this was my chance to travel the world. And it, to be honest, also paid for my studies and living back then, which of course was amazing. So I had a very great time. I did this for like 6-7 years, traveled all around the world. I lived in Taiwan, in Taipei. I traveled to Japan, to China, to back then also Italy, France. So it really broadened my horizon. Ultimately, it just gave me a way more international touch than I would have just had if I stayed in Austria back then.
And it really does sort of provide that bridge to what you do now, right? That you really are sort of this global person That's really interesting. What was that experience like? Obviously you're traveling to all these places, you're relatively young, you hear all about crazy stories about the industry.
The stories are true. Back then, it was actually quite interesting because social media didn't exist. So there was no Instagram, there was no Facebook. All we really had seen was it was just the start of America's Next Top Model, kind of, because that was in the it was in early 2000s. So I didn't really know what was going on when I first started traveling. And when I went to Taiwan back then, I was really trapped at my apartment in front of my washing machine and didn't know how to use it because this was the first time I was exposed to a washing machine, right? Not money laundering, but actually clothes
Actually
laundering,
washing,
right?
yeah.
So actual washing. So yeah, very interesting experience that helped me grow up quite fast because it was a tough business, to be honest. A lot of pressure working internationally. For me, I never had to do it because I needed the money, but because I enjoyed it and I saw it as a chance. So that was a huge advantage because if you have to do this for money, then it's a very, very challenging job because you get measured by standards that are very, very difficult to live up to.
Let's kind of dig into that transition a bit. So how did we go from international model to tax regulatory expert?
It all started at University of Vienna. I started studying there when I was 19 and I did my law master's there and then met one of the top experts of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm especially focused on the area of trafficking in human beings and migrant smuggling. He was then a great mentor and introduced me to the area of transnational cooperation to fight against organized crime and corruption. He was also a professor in Australia. So I did my PhD in Australia. And this is that was like the PhD was really mostly about international monitoring mechanisms like the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, etc., which should help to improve and foster transnational cooperation to fight against organized crime. So then the way to tax was not too far, to be honest, especially crypto tax. I often say that crypto taxes are more closely interlinked with AML than they are with actual taxes. And then I got exposed back then to crypto for the first time in 2016. I looked at Bitcoin as a means of payment for trafficking in human beings. Actually, back then, it first popped up with a report that we were writing on. Very interesting that at the same time, my roommate then that I lived with in Australia at the university, he made a lot of money with Bitcoin. So that's 2017, 2018, right? And so I was like, I need to look into that in more detail. I had an IT background, so I already knew about Bitcoin early on and I had dealt with it. I started to look at it more from an academical side as well, and then also in practice. And so I joined the crypto tax startup. That was more like by chance because I just had met the founder and he was an amazing guy that I really clicked with. And so we had a great vision that we could really make something happen here because we saw Europe as a great market. And so we scaled that quite well within Europe. And that was the path for me into crypto taxation.
It's so interesting. You have that sort of journey that's focused on the AML piece, the Financial Action Task Force and sort of global standards around that. But then I think themes like happenstance in some respects, it's sort of moved to tax where there was an opportunity to sort of build something. I mean, is that
exactly.
What's interesting is like there's only a handful of us, frankly, in this sort of AML illicit finance space. Tax is even a significantly smaller group than that. In fact, I think when I met you, you were one of the few people that I had ever met who was focused exclusively on cryptocurrency and taxation. When you got to this startup, when you started to kind of try to understand the space, that connection between cryptocurrency and tax, how did you do that?
The early days, there was not much evolved. So until recently, taxes and crypto were two things that were barely mentioned together, especially here in Europe, right? Whereas if you look at the United States, the IRS was quite early on enforcing tax laws. This was mainly because in the US, you have a tax reporting system which does not solely rely on individuals to report tax relevant information like we have in Europe. But this obligation is also put on service providers, some, like you might know, 1099s, right, that I'm talking about. So, however, recently, a lot of countries have acknowledged the huge amounts that are traded in digital assets and also the resulting taxable gain the individuals make from it and they're missing out on. So, of course, the countries are looking for ways to finance the economy. And now they figured out the crypto taxes might be one of those hidden champions, right? And I figured this out back in the early 2020s as well, that this was really a niche that not many people were working on. So I saw a lot of demand for expertise. So I really tried to tackle it from the bottom up and go first into, okay, what's the area of crypto tax actually combined of? I looked at it from the ground and then said, okay, this is where we go. And this is how we make it a policy priority as well. Because when I started talking about crypto and taxes, no one was really listening, right? So it was really helpful to have an AML background because especially in the European Union, end of the 2019, 2020, 2021, everyone was still just talking about anti-financial crime. No one was really talking about crypto and taxes. And so I always used my expertise also that I had in AML to then also highlight the importance of the taxation issue. Because ultimately, tax evasion and tax fraud are also financial crimes.
Absolutely. You're at Taxbit now. I actually recall saying to you something when we first met and you were describing sort of your role at the time. I said, so you're like Taxbit for Europe. And then I was very excited to hear that you joined the Taxbit team. Talk to me a little bit about sort of how that happened and your current role.
Yes. Like I said before, I worked at a crypto tech startup before that was mainly focused on retail. So for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been more working with institutionals and actual regulators on the area of crypto taxation. So at some point I noticed, okay, at my previous startup, I had done everything I could do as a chief legal back then. So I saw for me to just make the next step in my career and follow my passion. Taxbit was a fantastic option that opened up. Since Taxbit is really, so if we talk about Taxbit and what they actually do, they are really just focusing on institutional governments. So Taxbit doesn't do any retail. We serve 3 verticals, which is institutional accounting, institutional tax reporting, as well as governments for their crypto tax audits. We have done so with the IRS, for example, for the past 3 years with our solutions and also in close cooperation with players like TRM. So my role at Taxbit now is really about scaling this US concept we established with Taxbit first in Europe and then also beyond. So it's basically like I have a small startup here in Europe that we want to grow in the view of upcoming regulation.
That's fantastic. It makes so much sense. One thing that we sort of have delved into a bit, but I really want to kind of dig into is, look, the nature of tax is very national, right? It's at the state level. But crypto is so global, right? The promise of the technology itself is cross-border value transfer. Would you talk a little bit about sort of how that's playing out from a global taxation standpoint?
Yeah, so simply spoken, there are 2 different bubbles. The first being de facto taxation in individual jurisdictions, meaning if you are a US citizen, you always have to pay US tax. So it's really about national law and how tax is treated thereunder. The second bubble is international reporting, and that's where my strength lies. What I'm talking about here is the obligation of service providers to report tax relevant data of their customers to national competent tax authorities, which is, of course, quite tricky since this can happen anywhere. Let's imagine if you are a US citizen living in Australia, you still need to pay taxes in the United States. But how would the US tax authorities know that you actually made any relevant gains in Australia? This would most likely happen through an exchange that KYCs you. So it does know your customer. And so they take your personal data. And then this information at some point ends up with the authorities in the United States. And by the way, this process is very complex and exactly what is being negotiated on a global scale right now. We call it the Crypto Asset Reporting Framework. The Crypto Asset Reporting Framework is a global standard that has been negotiated within the OECD, and it introduces common reporting standards for every service provider. And I'm talking about big exchanges. I'm talking about partially also so-called DeFi applications that might be required to report thereunder, to report all the tax relevant data of their customers to the authorities in charge of tax enforcement. It basically spans 2 things. It requires service providers to collect all your KYC data and collect all your tax relevant information, trading data. And secondly, it establishes a framework for automatic exchange between competent authorities of member states of the OECD. And we are not talking about just the 38 member states of OECD, but also, I think it's 56 or 57 countries that adhered to the standards of the crypto asset reporting framework at New Delhi at the end of last year.
It's really extraordinary. People ask me all the time, will we have global regulations for cryptocurrency? And my answer is always no. We've never had global regulation for anything and never will. But we'll have consistent standards, and we see those developing in the AML space and in different aspects of the technology and the licensing regimes. It sounds like tax could potentially be different, where obviously it won't be law in specific jurisdictions, although it could be. But it does sound like there will be more global potential for global regulation in this space in particular because of the OECD, because of the information sharing that goes on amongst these jurisdictions. In line with this, talk me through DAC8, which I feel like is almost a corollary to what we're seeing happen at the OECD, but obviously with a true Europe focus.
I'll give you a very, very simple example that compares to what's happening with DAC8 right now. Since this is something you have talked about before, and a lot of people actually are more familiar with than with taxation, I talk about the Financial Action Task Force travel rule. The travel rule was negotiated as an international standard on the level of the Financial Action Task Force. And then there is regions that then implement the travel rule into law. In the European Union, this is done by the Transfer Funds Regulation. And similar to this process that was done on the AML level, it also happened in the taxation space. And this is why I said AML and tax are often way more interlinked than one might think. So on the OECD level, they now agreed on this crypto asset reporting framework. These, as you said, are only minimum standards. They are standards set globally. They are not law. In international law, we call that soft law, which means they are not actively enforceable within certain jurisdictions. These are just standards that most countries should comply with. So you have these standards that are agreed on the level of the OECD. And then the European Commission takes these standards and says, okay, we are now part of OECD. We're going to implement these OECD standards into actual law. And this law, this directive that they have agreed upon is the DAC8, the 8th amendment to the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, which is basically CARF, so the crypto asset reporting framework for the European Union.
That's really, really helpful. And what's interesting, I was going to ask you a question on the importance of public-private partnerships and information sharing, but it sounds like that's the bottom line. I mean, you're really you're relying in the US and in Europe on virtual asset service providers to provide that information to tax authorities, but you're really, it sounds like under CARF, relying on tax authorities to have very robust information sharing amongst themselves.
100%. And this is also because of the borderless nature of digital assets.
That's really helpful. It feels to me like Europe is ahead of a lot of the rest of the world on this today, and maybe it's given OECD and given the work that's been done there. Are there lessons here that you're seeing happen in real time in Europe that maybe can be applied elsewhere?
Okay. So historically, Europe and taxes have been a bit of a tricky relationship because of the member states, of individual member states. So the European Union has introduced standards for pretty much everything, ranging from phone charges to the shape of bananas. But taxes have always been a core subject of state sovereignty. So you will find very different taxation laws across the union. So for example, in Germany, crypto is generally subject to income tax, and crypto trades are a taxable event. Whereas on the other hand, in Austria, which historically has very similar laws, crypto is now subject to capital gains, with crypto-to-crypto transactions being non-taxable. So completely different, right? This is, of course, rather challenging, but at the same time, it's exactly what makes it so interesting to tackle.
When you think about working in the space, and for folks who don't know you, I mean, I literally see you everywhere whenever there's this conversation happening, certainly across Europe. When you think about where to engage with regulators, are you typically engaging at the national level, right? Because I mean, I think your point is really well taken about Germany and Austria, and you go to France and elsewhere across the bloc, that you're going to have different conversations on taxation and crypto assets. Or are you working at that sort of more standard setter OECD level where you can at least, influence what goes out at a high level to those different national authorities? I mean, where do you engage?
This is a very good question, actually. It's a question that I always ask myself as well, because you can't be everywhere, right? It's very important to have a holistic approach, but at the same time also be very, very efficient, right? As you said, there's barely anyone working in international crypto tax. So for me, the most important part in the European Union, of course, was the European Commission. So we work closely with TaxUD during the negotiations of DACA. But ever since it has been adopted, it's now really up to the individual member states to actually implement it. And also coming back to the implementation of DACA in the individual member states, right now on the level above the European Union, namely the OECD, they are negotiating the implementation standards and implementation manual that will be issued by OECD for all member states for the implementation of CAR. And this will have a huge impact how DAC8 in Europe will be practically implemented by the member states as well, right? So you see there is a lot of overlap. So I wouldn't say, okay, I'll target XYZ player because for XYZ reasons, but I would try to have a holistic concept. It's very important to be involved into the discussions at the OECD level and also at the European level. But for the European Union, then again, the implementation manual on the OECD level will be very important. So right now, I spend a lot of time talking to OECD and specific member states of the European Union as well, of course. And my colleagues in the US, I mean, they're constantly working with the IRS, right?
So that was going to be my next follow-up. And that is obviously, the focus of our conversation today is very much on Europe and sort of how they're thinking about crypto tax policy. But a comparison to the US may be helpful. Where are we in terms of IRS today?
I feel like that the US, especially in like the IRS is years ahead of the tax authorities in Europe. And the reason being that in Europe, crypto tax reporting has like the national competent authorities in Europe have always been depending on individual to actually declare their taxes on crypto gains. So there was no system of checks and balances. If I as an individual didn't declare any taxes, the government wouldn't have known that I actually hold crypto. Whereas in the United States, you had a system of checks and balances through 1099s. So the service providers already provided information to the IRS. So the IRS could actively enforce taxation law upon individuals. So that's why in the United States, I think that generally speaking, the tax transparency is way higher than it is in the European Union right now.
That's really, really helpful. Look, as we wrap things up, like think, from a forward thinking perspective here, what about DeFi? Right? Mika famously sort of kicked DeFi down the road a bit as well. How do you think about what taxation could look like in a truly decentralized space where people actually do transact on blockchains at scale?
Yes. I think what's great in Europe compared to the United States is that we have some kind of legal certainty, right? Of course, regulation is not always what market participants are asking for. However, if you look at the United States and their law by enforcement approach, you see that a lot of players are now eyeing with the EU since they have been the first ones to actually introduce a comprehensive legal framework for crypto assets like Mika, right? So this creates a lot of potential for the market and proves the willingness of the regulator to merge the digital asset space into the more traditional sector. But if we now look at decentralized finance, what even is decentralized, right? So with Mika, in the preamble, the recitals of Mika, it says that Mika shouldn't be applied to fully decentralized applications. But what does fully decentralized mean, right? If I look at it from the legal side, I mean, nothing is really fully decentralized. At some point, there's always a central person that creates something, and then it basically gets more and more decentralized as it grows, right? And this is why we're getting away from this term fully decentralized more to sufficiently decentralized. Also, I mean, this is something which is being discussed in the United States right now. How should the brokerage, like the reporting obligations, be applied to decentralized protocols, etc.? A simple answer is I don't know if it should be applied to decentralized finance or to whom it should be applied to. But if you ask me, looking into the future, where I see tax compliance being realized also in DeFi really is, I think what will be necessary for that is the introduction of digital identity. I think that you would need a digital identity that then also can comply with all the data protection requirements. So GDPR compliant digital identity, so to say. It can be coupled with CKP, zero knowledge proof, or some kind of privacy mechanism that actually gives you more privacy than you had before, right? So then you could somehow get to the point of what the BIS, the Bank of International Standard Settlement, described as embedded supervision or on-chain compliance, which means like if I transfer from my self-hosted wallet to your self-hosted wallet, and both of these self-hosted wallets are KYC through digital identity, then I could somehow also tackle this from a taxation point of view, right? I could implement this on-chain. Talking about that sounds very good from a legal point, but super scary from a privacy point, right? If I have embedded supervision, I mean, our system becomes even more transparent than it is right now. So do you really want to live in a world where each and every transaction that you proceed is fully transparent towards regulators if they want to see it? For the next 5 years, I don't see much changing, to be honest. I think that most of the upcoming regulation as per se is targeting intermediaries, especially those providing on and off ramp against fiat, because this is where most of the tax relevant information is actually at, right? Is at the on and off ramp against fiat.
It's absolutely interesting. And like, that's kind of the difference, because like you don't have to cash out necessarily in crypto today, right? To see gains. You got to some like really, really big issues. And, you know, it's interesting. You mentioned Arnold Schwarzenegger as a role model earlier in our chat. You know, honestly, he has been, I think for a lot of folks, I've always loved to listen to his speeches and the things he said out there. But he said something that resonated with me a bunch of years ago. I think just after being governor or right around that time, he says, "I welcome and seek your ideas, but do not bring me small ideas. Bring me big ideas to match our future." And to me, like, we're in a space of big ideas, right? It's about building a new, safer financial system. What really excites you about like the possibility of the space today?
To be honest, what really excites me here is that, especially with Taxbit, I'm really capable of actively shaping the market and really actively shaping the future. This is something that we see on the OECD level. This is something we see with the European Commission. The public-private partnership is very strong. So you as an individual that works in the space, or I am as an individual, can really do something. We can really shape something and make this something great, right? And this is something very, very important because, as you said, I think it's time for big ideas. And I feel that blockchain and the way we create a new financial market through blockchain and digital assets is really bringing more transparency and more fairness to the global ecosystem. It can, right? As long as it's treated the right way. So I feel like there is a lot of movement on a global scale. And what really excites me about that is that I'm being part of that. I'm being part of that and also actively shaping that. And I mean, people don't really care about taxes. Most people think taxes are annoying, right? But then again, if you look at taxation and the reason why you pay taxes, I live in Austria. We have an income tax rate of 55%. So we pay a lot of taxes. However, Vienna in the past 10 years has been voted the most livable city in the world. The reason being that it's super safe. We have a very good social and healthcare system. And this is what you do with taxes, right? When I talk about taxes, I really talk about social fairness and social justice. I think it's very, very important that this is also combined with the digital asset space as today. Because I mean, there are so many people making a lot of money from crypto. And I think it's very, very important to not always think about yourself, but also about others.
Really beautifully said. It impacts all kinds of policy decisions, from healthcare to environmental to kind of all the big issues of the day, right, are ultimately funded with tax dollars, and we're all part of a community, and that's part of the social contract. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. Obviously, Max, I cannot thank you enough for joining TRM Talks. This was incredibly fun, but also really educational. And I think it's rare that folks dig into the issues at this level, and just really grateful to have you in the space and grateful to have you as a friend. So thanks for coming on.
It was such a pleasure, Ari. Thanks for having me.
I promise the most interesting conversation on tax law that you've ever heard. And I think we nailed it, particularly, hitting who else can bring on a former model who is now Europe's expert on tax policy than TRM Talk. So really cool conversation with Max. But look, it was wonky, right? Which a tax conversation has to be. And I learned a lot. I have never professed to be a tax lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. And I love these conversations where I learn a lot. Look, I think trying to really compare and understand DC8, which is really the key legislation now in Europe for tax in the crypto asset space, and the IRS broker rule is really critical to understanding sort of this development of global standards. And I think that's absolutely critical. So I'm so glad that we really dug in to specifically CARF and DC8 and really understanding how Europe is approaching taxation in contrast, in comparison to IRS. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with Vanessa Karjenian, Director of Research at the Fidelity Center for Applied Technology, to discuss the way the most sophisticated traditional financial institutions engage with digital assets. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.